Hello and welcome back to the Minecraft Multiplatform modding series for Architectury, and in this episode I'm going to show you how we can create and add a basic simple entity to the game. Now, one thing I want to note at the beginning is that I'm not going to show you how you can create a model for your entity, because there are multiple tutorials on that on YouTube already, and I'm not very good at modeling things, so I'll leave that to people who know what they're doing in this case. And I'm just going to focus on how we can implement it in the game. Now I'm going to show you what you need to obtain for your model so that it works at the respective point in this video, so that you know where to get those code snippets from. But what I'm covering today is the entity classes that we need for the game itself, for the functionality of the entity, and then also for the client side, for the rendering and the model and everything else that is related to that, because there are quite a few things we need to do. So let's start by first creating a new package for our entities, or every class that is related to entities. And we created in our main package, call it entities. And in here, we want to create two classes. First, we want to create a class for a tutorial mod entity types. And this is the class where we will then later register our entity types in. And then we also want to create a class for our entity. In this case, since I'm very creative, I'm just going to add some horns to the regular cow model. And with that, we have a bull. So that's my idea. Now, for the sake of this video, I'm not going to go over functionality, what an entity can do. I'm going to cover that in a future episode. So for this episode, I'm just going to implement the bull as if it was a cow. So for this, I'm going the shortcut and easy way and just extend the regular Minecraft cow class in our bull class here, and then we simply need a constructor for our bull class, and that's everything we want to do right here. But as you can see, if we look into the cow class, there are a lot of things that are in here, and I'm going to go over those in a future episode, how we can do this. For now, we just want our entity with rendering and model to appear in the game. Now, the next step is that we want to register our entity to the game. Or to be more precise, we want to have an entity type that we can use for everything else regarding this entity. And for this, inside this class, we are first, as always, going to create a private static final deferred register for entity type of question mark, import the class, and we call it entities, and then as always deferred register.create for our tutorial mod id and the registries.entity type. Next up, we want to have a registry supplier, a public static registry supplier for entity type of our bull class, and we call that bull. Then we also want to have a public static void init entity types, in which we can then register entity types, and we also want to have a helper method so that we don't have to write a piece of code every single time, which looks like this. We have a private static registry supplier of entity type of t, and we define t as anything that extends entity. And then we take the name and a supplier for said entity type, and then just on the deferred register, we register it with the resource location, this entity type. Same thing we did for essentially everything else we wanted to register. And then in our init entity types method, we can then go ahead and register an entity type for a bull. We call that bull, and then we provide a supplier. And now for entity type dot builder dot off. Next, we need an entity factory. As you can see, that is simply the constructor for our bull class and a mob category. So for our entity factory, it's bull and then new. And then for the category, you can go to mob category and then see what Minecraft has here. So for example, creature, that is what we are going to use here. That is all animals. Then we have water creatures. Those are things like fish, squids, etc. Misc, monster, all the different types of entities that exist in the game. We want to use creature in this case. And now we want to add the properties for our entity. So in this case, I'm just going to use the same properties that we have for the regular cow, which is this here. So the first thing I do here is sized, and sized sets the hitbox size. So depending on the model you use, you need to change those values here, obviously. So the width and the height of the hitbox. The eye height is relevant for the eye line on the hitbox. So if you look at the hitboxes through the debug screen, you always see the line sticking out of the hitbox, and that is the eye line of the entity, and this determines the height where this eye height comes out of the hitbox. The passenger attachment here, that defines at which points in the model or on the hitbox essentially a passenger on that mob is attached. So in this case we just have one attached point, so if an entity was to be sitting on top of our bull, this is the point where this entity would be located. And the last thing here is the client tracking range. So if the client gets outside of this range, the mob is no longer tracked for this client. But there are many other options, as you can see here. You can, for example, add you can, for example, set that a mob is fire immune here. You can define name tag offsets. You can define writing offsets, other features, attachments, etc. But we're not going to do this today. Instead, we're doing what we need to do in the end. As you can see, it won't work right now since we have a builder here and not a entity type as we need down here. So we need to call the build method, and in here we need a resource key for an entity type, and in this case this resource key is just a resource key for the entity we are currently creating. So we want to create a resource key for the entity type registry and then provide the resource location for this bull entity we are defining down here. And as every time after we've registered our entities to the default register, we need to call the register method to put everything into the game. Now the next step, we also want to call this init entity types method down here. So tutorial mod entity types dot init entity types. Now you may think, yeah, we did everything we need to do. That is sort of true, because we now have theoretically a valid entity. We could spawn this entity and the server would handle it just fine, because for the server an entity is essentially just the hitbox moving through the world, and the hitbox we've defined here. But as soon as a client tries to render this entity, the client would crash because we haven't given the client any information yet on how to handle the bull entity rendering. And that is the thing we want to do next. So the first thing we want to do for that is we want to add a texture for our entity so that the client actually has something we can render later. I've already prepared this texture, and we want to move it to the texture folder, and in here to the entity folder. And as you can see, it just is the regular cow texture, but with the horn attachments up here, so those will later be then rendered as the horns of the cow. Other than that, it's just a regular cow. Alright, now that we have a texture, we want to create a few more classes. Inside of our entities package up here, I'm going to create a client package, and in here we can now place all the classes that are only needed for the client. And the first is we need a model for our bull, so we call the class bull model. Next, we need a renderer for our bull. We call that bull renderer. And the renderer. Then we want to have a class where we specify all our rendering initializations things. So tutorial mod entity rendering. I call this class. And in here we are going to register all the rendering and model related things. And last but not least, we want to define a class for a tutorial mod model layers. And the model layers essentially tell the game how to map textures onto models. Let's actually start with the model layers class because it's the most simple of all. We just define a public static final model layers location for a bull, which is just a new model layer location. And then in here, we need to provide a resource location, which is the resource location for a bool entity. So in our tutorial mod.modID namespace with bool, and then we need to define the layer, and this is main in this case. And with this, essentially we define that if we associate later a renderer to this model layer location, that we want to render onto the main part of the model. Now let's actually add the model for our bool. For this, we are going to extend here quadruple model for living entity render state. Now, why use quadruple model? As you can see here, the quadruple model already defines the body parts for a standard animal-like entity you know in the game. So we have a head, a main body, and then the 4 legs of an entity. So if you think a sheep has exactly those body parts, a cow has the same body parts, a pig has the same body parts, etc. And this just takes a lot of the basic work, as you can see, because, for example, the animation things we don't have to worry about anymore if we just use the quadruple model, because it already provides the animations for us. So we don't have to worry about animating our model. Now in here, we need to implement a constructor. We want to make this constructor public. And then we want to create another method, and that is the public static layer definition. And we call that create body layer. How you name this method is not entirely relevant because we just call it from our own code, but create body layer is the name the game uses for all the methods internally for the standard vanilla models. And in this method, we now create the mesh definition and the layer definition for our entity. And this is the part that you need to obtain through a modeling program. Like Blockbench, for example, has, if I remember correctly, plugins where you can generate those pieces of code here. I'm going to go over what we see here real quickly. So the mesh definition is essentially the base layer of the model. So all the shapes you see, that's the mesh definition. And then we have here the part definitions, and this part definition.getRoot, that is the main part that we defined in our model layers. This main layer, that is essentially the root part of our mesh definition. And into this part definition here, we then add the 6 subparts we saw in the quadruple model earlier. So the head, the body, and the 4 legs. And in here, we then specify this text offsets. These are offsets in the texture file later. So those essentially specify which parts of the textures should be used. And then we define the box, which is just a cube in the model later when it's rendered. And this texture is then mapped onto this defined cube. But again, those parameters, you will probably want to generate those through a modeling application. And after you've added all your body parts, the last thing you need to do is to create a layer definition out of those. So you use layer definition.create with the mesh definitions, and then those 2 values here, those specify the dimensions of your texture. So this texture has, as you can see, 64 by 64 pixels. So you need 64 by 64 here because all those texture offsets you defined here earlier, those relate to the texture with these dimensions. So you need to make sure that the texture has the correct dimensions. And that's everything you want to do for your model. Next, we want to add the renderer for our model. So we go to our bool renderer class, and in here we want to extend the mob renderer class. Now the mob renderer class needs 3 type parameters. The first one is the entity this renderer is related to, in our case the bool class. Next, we need again the living entity render state, which is the same render state we used in our model here. And finally, we need the class for our model, so our bool model class here. And inside of this class, we first need to implement 2 methods, and those are the get texture location and the create render state methods, both annotated with not null, and we need a constructor. Now we also want to define a resource location here for our texture file so that we can utilize this easier. So our cow texture location in this case, or let's call it bull texture because we have a bull, is in our mod.id namespace, and then the textures entity bull.png. This is the part to this texture file we added here. Now for the constructor, we want to delete the last two parameters here because we need to specify them directly. For entity model, we just create a new bull model with context.bakeLayer for our tutorial mod model_layers.bull. With this, we tell the model that we want to use the main definition and mapping we defined here on this model. And the second parameter here, this float, this is the shadow radius of the shadow that is rendered on the ground. For the regular cow, it's 0.7. And so I'm going to use 0.7 as well. If you have a smaller mob, you want to choose a smaller value here. If you have a larger mob, you want to choose a larger value here. And next, we want to go to the two remaining methods here. The texture location is pretty simple. We just return the bull location we defined earlier. And for the living entity render state, we just create a new living entity render state. That works totally fine. So that is everything we need to do for the renderer. Now, last but not least, we need to register the renderer. And for this, we go to our entity rendering class and add a public static void init entity rendering here. Now, this is slightly different to the rest because we don't need a deferred register for the entity rendering because the entity rendering is client-side and not done through the classical registries. So we need to do something similar to the registering of the screen in the last episode. As you remember here, we used the menu registry from Architectury, and Architectury again provides us with registries for this. So we first want to have the entity rendering registry, renderer registry. And in here we want to register. And the first thing here is our entity type. So our tutorial mod entity types.bull. And the second is then the corresponding renderer, in our case the bull renderer with the new. And that's the renderer. And then we need to define or register the model layers. So for this we have the entity model layer registry. Let me import this class, registry. And then we want to call on here also the register method with the model layer location, which is of course in our tutorial model layers.bull. And then we want to reference the bull model and here the create body layer method we defined. So this maps this model then onto this model layer location we have defined here. And that's everything we need to do for the rendering initialization here. So again, we need to add to our main class, and then in the end, we want to add the client lifecycle event as you've seen in the screen video. So client lifecycle event client started.register, so that this code is only executed on the client side because the server can't do any rendering. And with that, we have the rendering completely registered. But there are still two small things missing because an entity also has attributes, like for example the health, and an entity should. The second thing is not necessarily required. The attributes are definitely required, but the second thing are the spawn placements, and the spawn placements determine how an entity should spawn on the ground, for example, so that an entity doesn't spawn in blocks if generated through the game. And those things we should also register. So we go in here and use the entity attribute registry.register, and here we also need to provide our entity type and then our attributes. And for this, the class we have created has the create attributes method. In this case, it just uses the attributes from the cow, so a bull has the same attributes as a cow, but essentially if you want to override those, you can see here you can use animal.createAnimal attributes and then add the different attributes. And the second thing, we want to add the spawn placements registry, and in here we also want to register our entity type, our tutorial mod entity types.bull, And the spawn placements are now a bit more complicated, so I'm just going to copy this part over. Now, the first thing is the spawn placement type. So in this case on ground, which means our entities should spawn on the ground. Then the height map type, motion blocking no leaves. That means that we want to spawn in a place where the motion is not blocked, and so where the entity could move. And we don't want to include leaves in this group because there are some animals that can spawn on leaves. We don't want that. And the last thing, we check the animal spawn rules. Those are the default animal spawn rules that determine if a place is suitable to spawn an animal. That's everything we need to do in here. But if you remember in the last episode about the menu types and the screens, I said that yeah, there is a problem with the Architectury registries and NeoForge, and the same is true for the rendering part for entities. So essentially, this part here works as it should work as it is both on NeoForge and Fabric. In reality, at least for the versions I'm using here, this only works for Fabric. So I'm also going to show you how to fix that again. So in this case, we just want to hear if platform.isFabric, just to make sure that those two are then only called on the Fabric side. And for NeoForge, we're going to our NeoForge main class, and down here in the client mod events, similar to the last time. And in here, we need to add 2 events, which I'm going to copy in. And the first one is the FML client setup event. And in here, we want to register the renderer. So we call entity renderers.register with our entity type. Important here, we need to .get at the end because we have a supplier here and need the entity type raw here. And then the bool renderer new. This is essentially the first line we have here. And then the model layer registry, as you can see, we have the create body layer down here. And this is done in the entity renderers event.register layer definitions event. And yeah, again, here we want to register the layer definition for the bool entity. And here we use the supplier actually and do not need to put the .get at the end. And we again reference the create body layer. So if those two lines don't work for you on NeoForge, you can use the NeoForge way using those 2 client setup events here. But that is everything we need to do. So let's start the game and see our entity in the game. And with that, welcome to the game. Now let me summon a bull real quick, and as you can see, it looks like a cow with horns, and that's because it is a cow with horns. So that is our bull in the game. As you can see, I'm trying to middle click this right now. We don't have a spawn egg yet. I'm going to show you how you can add a spawn egg also in a future episode. But yeah, that is a basic entity in the game. This is a Fabric instance. Let me quickly show you that this also works in NeoForge. And now this is NeoForge here. Let me summon a bull, and here we have our bull, the cow with horns, as we defined it. Now with that, you know how you can add your own entity so that it renders in the game, and as you can see, the animations also work. In the next episode, I'm going to show you how we can add spawn eggs for once, and then I'm probably also going into a bit more regarding the things you can do with your animal class, like breeding, for example. Yeah. See you then. Goodbye.